Right, okay. Bear with me, Aqab. I'll make co-host. That's it, all done.
Okay, so I'm going to, here we go. So if you can all see the full screen that I've got here.
Yes.
Everything's good. So I'm going to be talking about the Taliban challenges, solutions to Afghanistan situation, and talk about what's happened initially, how they took over, and what the problems will be in the future, more likely than not. But if you forgive me, I will be using. Can you see me at all, or is it just a screen that you can see?
What I'll do is
Yes.
We'll see both.
We can see both.
Yeah, we can see you and yeah.
See the screen too.
So I'll be using my flask with a little bit of water in it now and again. So initially, what I'll be talking about, these few issues here, if you can take a note of that, but I'll be going through everything here in the next maybe 15 to 20 minutes it'll take, I think. And then we can go on to a question and answer session as long as you like. I think Jan would be, he'll be the boss in that and dictate the time. So my views are presented here. My own independent thoughts do not represent. I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats in Tunbridge Wells. I'm a member of the executive, so it doesn't represent the Liberal Democrats or any other institution or academic institution at this moment in time.
Aqab, you're in good company.
Thank you. So we've always got a turmoil here. We're a minority party, but we're an evolved minority party, hopefully. Although some people may not be. It does happen then people come and go as they please, but that's life. Now, so I'll be talking about the rise of Taliban, just briefly, just to give you a precursor about what they were. Some people are not aware of that. The Taliban arose in 1994 from the bitter civil war between the Mujahideen. After the Mujahideen had beaten the Soviet Union and the communist PDPA had given in by 1992. But for 2 years or so, there was a bitter civil war between different Mujahideen factions based on their religious orientation, the Shia and the Sunni aspect, as well as the ethnic divide between the country of the Pashtun, the Tajik, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks, and some of the other small ethnic groups. That divide was accentuated throughout throughout the war against the Soviet Union. They call it the Afghan Jihad. Primarily because of the parties funding different groups, whether it was the Saudis, the Americans, Pakistan, the Iranians. So you can imagine different sides supported different countries and vice versa. And as a result, they had a lot of grievances with each other and led into a bitter civil war for control of power in the country. By 1994, the Taliban had arisen and to incorporate the idea of a united Afghanistan, but that united Afghanistan was to be under a very draconian literal interpretation of Islam through the Deobandi interpretation, going back to the origins of Islam 1400 years ago, without the interpretation of what happened afterwards for the past 1400 years. So it was a very literal black and white interpretation of the Quran, the Hadith, and Sunnah. That's what they wanted to institute. And by 1996, they'd captured over 95% of the country. Only a small area of the country in the north, Badakhshan province, was holding out with Ahmad Shah Massoud. However, in the wider scale, in the US, by 1998, there was the first Trade Center bombing, not in 2001, but the one in 1998, which was relatively small and more or less a failed bombing. But as a result of that, the United States bombed Al-Qaeda bases that included militant groups, other militant groups like Harakat al-Mujahideen, Harakat al-Ansar, and these other groups that had set up base in Afghanistan, as well as Al-Qaeda. and a number of others. For example, ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is a movement of Uyghur Muslims from western province of Xinjiang in China, who'd set up base in Afghanistan under the umbrella of Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. And as a result, the Americans wanted to punish Al-Qaeda and bombed certain areas in eastern Afghanistan at that point, certain targets. A number of people died. But that was a refocusing of American policy, therefore. And Afghanistan came to the fore again after many years of being away after the Cold War had ended, because it was no longer a priority for the United States. Nevertheless, Al-Qaeda continued to operate from Afghanistan, and the Taliban didn't put any blocks or chokes onto it, even though it would have been deemed detrimental to the global future in essence. And there was a lot of upheaval in that respect. By 2001, 2 days before the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda had sent operatives into the northern areas and assassinated Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was the Tajik leader and the opposition to Taliban, giving way to what would presume to have been a Taliban offensive to take the rest of the country. However, they also 2 days later attacked the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And I think we all know about that, so we don't really need to go into that too much. But in doing so, Afghanistan was to face the wrath of America, the United States, and NATO contingency, one is attacked or all are attacked, came into being as well then. So the United States invaded Afghanistan on the 7th of October 2001. Now, I'm not going to talk about so much about what happened in the past 20 years, but I would like to talk about certain things that occurred during the American occupation, which is what it was. It was an occupation by foreign powers. Whether or not the local people wanted it or not, the power brokers were the warlords, and they felt it feasible for themselves to maintain their power structure. And there was a lot of corruption in this. But nevertheless, there were a lot of successes as well. And United States started to rebuild Afghanistan to an extent. Whether that was strategically planned from the beginning or not is not in dispute, because it was not. It was an ad hoc policy from one stage to the other when the Americans got distracted by Iraq, the Iraq War, and put less emphasis on Afghanistan. The Taliban started rebuilding themselves again. Nevertheless, they spurred economic and industrial growth through foreign direct investment and provide economic opportunities for the Afghan population to rebuild the economy, the United States did, as well as other Western powers. Afghanistan availed opportunities from the US investment in various sectors, such as energy, technology, transportation, development, education, and many others, led to a large-scale reconstruction of some of the, as a post-war reconstruction of Afghanistan in many different areas, especially the infrastructure, railways to a minimal extent, but largely roads, especially the major ring road around Afghanistan that linked the major cities, as well as energy infrastructure that they built up. There was also political improvements, emancipation of females, minority rights, political participation, essentially, at least in writing, of most minority groups, and education of females was instituted in the fullest sense, as you can imagine. Media participation was extensive. Tolo, for example, the TV and media network was built up extensively, and I watched this happen over the last two decades. I think many of you may have seen this or aware of it. There were also development of democratic governance structures. You've got to understand that democracy was never even a concept in the psyche of the average Afghan. It didn't exist. So to institute democratic structures was an important aspect of governance and enhancing the governance structure of Afghanistan. Yet, there's no doubt that many aspects or many facets of Afghanistan, many parties in Afghanistan opposed this because they felt that this was an occupying force instituting their own idea of governance into a nation that never experienced it and deemed it as anathema to their way of life. And the Taliban stuck to this from the beginning to the end, and now going to be changing the governance structure in that respect. But these are some of the benefits that did occur. Now, the veracity of these benefits may not come into fruition, primarily because the Taliban has retaken power. Let's go into that for a second before we go on about the challenges that might be faced. So there was a rapid takeover. I don't think anybody realized that after the United States and the Western powers would have left, that Afghanistan was going to be so rapidly taken over within a matter of weeks. I think even I predicted that it would take several months at least. And I think even the Taliban didn't realize that what they had done was shore up their assets, negotiate a whole network of people around Afghanistan in the administration, the existing Afghan administration, the power brokers, the strong people and power centers around the country, and negotiated with them over the last couple of years, especially during the time when it was recognized that the Americans were going to leave. So the Taliban began this process well in advance. But again, I don't think they recognized that it would happen so quickly. It's primarily because the Afghan government didn't want to fight. I think there was a rot set into the Afghan government because of the massive corruption that had taken place. And in essence, it was like a ghost army, the National Afghan Army, primarily because it was made of numbers of people who were not actually there to continue input of money and supplies into the Afghan armed forces, which were fizzled out through a lot of corruption, unfortunately. That led to the downfall of the National Afghan Army and the government very quickly, because they weren't able to sustain full-scale attacks by the Taliban. And when the momentum grew, it became so rapid that the government gave up very quickly. Even Karzai flew out within a matter of days, which led to the breakdown and the fall of the government. Immediately, as soon as they took power, they banned females from school and work. And this is something that we all feared that would happen. I think it was a fear that they would return Afghanistan to the 1990s, their draconian way of thinking. Now, there has been suggestion by the Taliban that they had changed. And I think there was a lot of hope over the past few years that they would have changed the way of their thinking, that they would have allowed female participation, especially political participation, and schools, and allowing females to work. But this was not to be immediately. So their excuse was that they were not catered towards being able to provide security for females, because their own fighters who were so indoctrinated against such an idea of females working or going to school, that they would not be, they'd have to re-educate their own armed forces, for example, their own fighters, who could take things out of control. So they used this excuse to ban all females initially, have returned about 75% of all females, maybe 80% now, but that's largely for the younger section of the population, from up to high school at the latest, but not, I don't think, at university level yet. And they're trying to institute segregation at all levels so that they would allow females to come back, and they promised this would happen, but we haven't seen real progress in that yet. There is a contradiction. They initiated a charm offensive at the beginning, as soon as they took power, that we want recognition from the world, and we're willing to do this and the other. We want to be party to the World Committee, to the global governance, and be part of the global community. However, as soon as they set up an interim government, it was a 53-member male cabinet with 0 females involved. I'll give you some statistics to indicate exactly what was there beforehand, and the current developments that occurred just before the Taliban took power. For example, the challenges that they faced. Taliban are now the government in Afghanistan, but they face the same challenges as any other country in the world. such as agricultural jobs, creation, infrastructure building, the science and technology, trade and commerce is very, very important. Education and training, even their defense and security, which is very dispersed at this moment in time. Capacity building in all aspects of governance structure, energy and water, and their strategic aspects as well. So these are just a few of the major aspects that they're concerned about. There are many others, as in any other country. And you've got to appreciate that Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world still. So some of these may have been prioritized to the detriment of others. For example, education and training are not a high priority as opposed to defense and security as far as the Taliban are concerned. We have to appreciate that they have been fighting for 20 years, and in essence, they've not been in governance. So they don't have on-the-ground reality experience in governance, except for one or two, a handful of people that learned some things in governance in the 1990s. But largely, the Taliban is very different now. So we have to appreciate that they're coming from a different aspect now, although they've not trained for it. And as a result, we need to understand what we can do. Now, just a visual on the larger powers, for example, the United States, the EU, which we're now out of, unfortunately, Japan and China, the economic powers that run the world, in essence, and military powers to an extent. For example, China and America and Russia, large military powers. India is coming up as well. And this is Afghanistan as an economic power. It's minuscule, it's tiny. You can imagine the power, the collective power the world has to dictate terms to the Taliban for a bunch of ragtag fighters who've come into power because they sustain, and we've got to give them this, brave opposition to occupation. However, look at what they face in the world. If they want to be part of the global community, these six are just part of the global power structure. And we have many more. There's about 200, isn't there? So we've got to appreciate that there's a large degree of power in the hands of the large economic powers that they can dictate terms to Afghanistan. But I don't think that's a priority now. Unfortunately, the world has taken a turn also where geopolitics is involved. In fact, the geopolitical environment in the world has taken a turn because the United States and China are seemingly coming to a polarizing opposition where their influence in economic and strategic terms and interests are polarizing now. Their influence is in a competition in Eurasia, in South America, in Africa, Southeast Asia, even Australasia, all around the world where they're competing with each other. It seems like a new Cold War has already begun. And the United States in their latest strategic review and grand strategy indicate that China is now a strategic competitor as opposed to just being a partner, economic partner, or even in investment terms. They are an economic and strategic competitor, which means that China, as far as the United States is concerned, cannot be trusted. And vice versa, Chinese do not trust the United States and other Western powers. So we're looking at a more polarized world now. So if there was a cohesive approach to Afghanistan, that chance has disappeared. Maybe 5 years ago, we could have done something, but I find that chance to having a cohesive, collective approach towards Afghanistan and the Taliban has taken a turn also. I think that unfortunately, certain parties will support the Taliban more so than others and use it as another lever against another opposing parties, for example. And so, unfortunately, I find that Afghanistan may become another pawn in the global competition. That's not just global, but also regional. For example, regional alignments are taking place. There's a lot of things happening, not just in this region, but globally. Climate change has taken the fore. Sustainable development is a crux of the future in economic development around the world. Asia is rising, so the power of the West is reducing, primarily because Asian countries are now becoming more economically driven. And we've seen the tiger economies over the last 20, 30 years have risen substantially. China has risen immensely to become the second largest economic power. Yet there are still many conflicts of interest, as I mentioned, geopolitically and regionally. Regionally, we have India, and China competing with each other, again, for their interest in social, military, and economic spectrum, and influence in Southeast Asia, in Indian Ocean especially, and the Persian Gulf. And Afghanistan will play a part in that, in Central Asia and access to Central Asian resources. I think India wants to increase and enhance itself as a future global power by increasing its geopolitical reach within at least the Indian Ocean region and beyond. It's already instituted the building of a I would say, semi-blue water navy, where they want at least 200 warships on the sea. By 2027, China is rapidly increasing their capacity, naval capacity, to become the largest naval group in the world, although not to the same technological level of the United States. Yet they're competing in a very immense scale right now. So we can imagine potential conflict in this region. This is what I'm trying to indicate, that it's no longer going to be peaceful the way we might think or want. The fact of the matter is, Chinese have instituted since 2013 the Belt and Road Initiative. They initially called it the One Belt, One Road Initiative, but now, just to shorten it, to make it easier for themselves, I guess, the Belt and Road Initiative, which they've pushed out towards most of the Eurasian and Africa, where they've been buying up large tracts of land and literally governments to be able to extend their reach. In fact, China would like to become a middle-income country in the next 10, 15 years. And in doing so, they've realized that in order to maintain productivity and economic competition, to maintain that and to reach that economic height that they want to, that they have to learn to outsource. So one of the things that they need to do is have connectivity with other nations in Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa through the sea. The String of Pearls, for example, many ports that they want to institute, which will no doubt also have a naval bearing, as well as land bridges with countries through rail and road networks to allow the goods to flow through. In order to have outsourcing, they want to be able to control economic production for the next 40, 50 years. But in doing so, they're learning to influence other countries and even to an extent dictate economic terms with other countries. I don't think Afghanistan in this respect is any different. Afghanistan has always been seen as a potential corridor for the Chinese, especially because of the potential for rare earth minerals. We know that quite a few years ago that the United States and other countries and companies, in fact, discovered the potential for at least $3 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. And if you're aware that rare earth minerals are the basis and foundation of future technology. So for China to be able to dominate future technology, and they already have control of around 85 to 90% of rare earth minerals around the world, they want to control the future resources as well. And Afghanistan will be a future resource. And when we say there's only been a discovery of so far of 3 trillion, there's probably many, many more. And that's going to be a very large cash output to them. Is that mine? Okay, so there's another aspect. China will want to maintain economic contact. Could you hear me properly here?
It might help if everybody else muted.
Oh, yes.
It's because there's interference and it's hard to talk when there's lots of noise. I think we're okay now. So China will maintain economic contact with Taliban at this moment in time, and people exchange it, but they haven't promised any official signature to any extension of the BRI right now. But they're just watching what will happen in Afghanistan because they have their own concerns as far as counter-terrorism is concerned, because of the ATIM group, and the Uyghurs, and their potential to instill instability in the Western province in China. So they're using that as a key to the Taliban to make sure that they put the Taliban into some form of control, to look at the potential where Afghanistan can look at future prospects of economic prosperity, but still be able to control it. I don't think the United States wants to impart any further money into it. I think they're leaving it to the Chinese and maybe even the Russians to invest in that country. I think there's an interest where we all realize liberal interdependence, economic interdependence matters, in the sense that when we have convergence of economic means, one way of controlling the Taliban to an extent is through economics, as has happened in Europe, with the exception of Britain now, where two parties who are constantly in war, like France and Germany for centuries, have been forced into a form of peace and now partners in peace because of economic interdependence. And now the idea is that Afghanistan could be pulled into some form of regional economic interdependence where their livelihoods will depend completely on the economic situation of other countries and vice versa. So they will not disrupt other countries economically and vice versa, because they will be disrupted again. Now, it's slightly different because the understanding of economics is not profound. I remember when I was in Afghanistan in the late 90s, when I was a researcher for my PhD, that I met the chairman, you could say, the person in charge of that Afghanistan bank, such as the Bank of England, but the Bank of Afghanistan. And this was a young 24-year-old mullah, religious scholar of 24 years old, who had no education in economics. So I met many others who were placed in these very important positions where they had no idea what they were doing and how to run different ministries. And I've said again and again, many TV interviews recently, especially, that the Taliban, Afghanistan, requires professionals and technocrats and diplomats, people who are trained over the last 20 years to be able to run the economy and run manufacturing systems, if there are any, or the security of the country in a professional way, rather than as a guerrilla group, which they were very good at. So it's going to take time for that to be translated into reality. Yet, if that can occur, then economic development can occur in Afghanistan. Through economic development, liberalization could occur. Although, then again, we look at Iran and we look at that as an economic power because it's a gas and oil giant, relatively speaking, especially in that region. It's a very large economic power in the region, yet it's not liberalized to a large extent. I don't think Afghanistan will go down that line. I think that there are many forces acting on the Taliban to make it liberalized to some extent. I don't think they're liberalized to the extent that we feel liberalization. The freedom of speech, for example, emancipation and equality of all, gender, irrespective of race, gender, religion, etc. But I think that is a route forward, and it's a work in progress, but it's also proven in many different countries. I think we need to utilize this asset that we have. But one of the concerns of the world has been voiced many times over the past years, and especially in the past few months in the Taliban takeover, was how does Afghanistan contain extremism? One of the biggest fears was that if Afghanistan was taken over by the Taliban, that extremism would return. Extremism, in fact, meaning that non-state actors, violent non-state actors, extremist groups would take over power in certain areas of the country, that they would be facilitated by the Taliban. Now, the Taliban has indicated that they will never allow this to occur again. I think after 20 years of war, they've realized that this cannot happen again. They cannot allow external parties or internal parties to dictate terms to the country, whatever the case might be, if it's in terms of extremism and violence and terrorism. However, in 2014, Pakistan began a campaign of very large-scale counter-terrorism operations on the western border of Pakistan against terrorists, Taliban-linked terrorists in Pakistan, called Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistan Taliban. With these, there were many foreign terrorists as well, including Chechens, North Africans, Syrians, and Iraqis, as well as Chinese groups who were there fomenting problems and actually took large swathes of the Northwest Frontier Province. At that time, it was called. Actual territory that we're able to hold. The Pakistan authorities pushed back and took away their control and defeated them thoroughly. I was in fact involved in the counterterrorism strategy formulation, where I wrote the counterterrorism strategy position paper, which became the foundation of the main counterterrorism strategy to be utilized against non-state actors, terrorism, and extremists. And that helped the military to successfully, probably one of the most successful counterterrorism operations in the world hitherto, where they're taking a life is not a good thing in any way, but they killed over 20,000 militants and terrorists and pushed the rest out of Pakistan. And from hundreds of bombings every month, literally tens of bombings every day, hundreds of people dying every single day in Pakistan, to sporadic attacks once in a blue moon now in Pakistan. I think that was a massive success. And as a result, what happened was that many of these people that got away got into the largely ungoverned areas of eastern Afghanistan and different parts of the deserts or unpopulated areas in the mountains. And in doing so, they started setting up opposition to Pakistan from there with the help of other nations, for example, India, who are in a virtual state of Cold War with Pakistan for the last 73, 74 years now, 75 years it will be soon. I think they've been hurting each other for many years, and these parties, these countries utilize many different facets around the world to damage each other, as do the large powers in effect, but a smaller version of their Cold War. To this extent, Islamic State in Syria and Iraq was becoming quite successful in that region in the Middle East. And so they formed a linkage, these people that were pushed out, linkage, because they didn't feel that the Taliban were accepting their version of what they wanted, because the Tehrik-e-Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, had a more internationalist perspective and agenda, a jihadist agenda, whilst the Taliban began refocusing completely on just maintaining or gaining back the country without an internationalist agenda. So there was a chasm and a fracture between the two different groups, the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban. And as a result, the Pakistani Taliban swore allegiance to the Islamic State. Excuse me. In doing so, when the Pakistani Taliban has been pushed out of Pakistan, they were given resources. Experienced fighters came from the Middle East and helped them rebuild and re-network. And the Islamic State Khorasan was formed in 2015 by these former members. And they currently operate in northern and eastern Afghanistan, close to the capital. And I'm sure you've heard of the bombing on the airport as the Americans were departing, the Western troops were departing. But these things have been happening regularly, before and after. The fact of the matter is that the Islamic State Khorasan has shown that they're absolutely hostile to the Taliban, because the Taliban doesn't accept their more extremist version of Islam, but also that the Taliban is not abiding by the international version of what the jihadists want. And as a result, the Taliban have become seen more as nationalists now, that they just want to maintain control of the country that they lost because they supported similar elements. I think the Taliban has learned a lesson this way, and the Taliban has consistently mentioned that they will try to maintain control, to the extent that there have been many offensives against the Islamic State Khorasan by the Taliban before the Taliban took control, and hitherto, with over 600 commanders, high-ranking commanders, and other fighters captured, significant fighters captured by the Taliban. Now, this doesn't seem like much, but in a country where thousands matter, just a handful of thousands to change the future of a country, that so many people and high-ranking commanders, as well as even just the other day, the deputy head of the Islamic State Khorasan was killed by the Taliban. It shows that there's something happening. However, the Taliban have sworn that they will never allow other groups to do so. Nevertheless, the potential for extremists to exploit vacuums, because they don't have complete control of the country the way, for example, the powers to be in major countries do. The coercive power of the state must be instituted around the country. Coercive seems like a harsh word to use, but in essence, the police force and the Navy and the armed forces, for example, altogether, institute a way to maintain law and order in every country. And the Taliban doesn't have such control yet because it's learning to translate its opposition to the government into becoming a government at this moment in time. And the fear is that vacuums will pop up in different parts of the country, or there will be opposition by certain sections of the country that may foment or allow extremists to filter in and set up their own bases again. And this is one of the fears of the Western powers and other countries, especially Pakistan and Iran and neighboring countries, China, and even countries that are opposed to their own neighbors. For example, Saudi against Iran. Saudi worries that the Iranians will foment opposition through the Hazaras, who are Shia predominantly, against Saudi interests in Afghanistan. And Pakistan is worried that India will foment trouble for Pakistan with parties that may institute attacks from Pakistan. In fact, there was a discussion lately that an argument between the Taliban, in fact, and Pakistan about the border being fenced up by Pakistan since 2017, which is largely nearly completed, 90% completed. And there's a history in that, which I'm not going to go into because of the Pashtunistan issue, because it divides the Pashtun population. But these arguments are coming to the fore, where even the Taliban is coming into opposition of a former ally, they call them, Pakistan, for example. So I don't want to go into too much detail because we can talk about this as we move on or in the question and answers. One of the greatest fears is emancipation, the progress that's been made in Afghanistan, the education of females, for example. Girls' schools slowly reopen, although there are conflicting claims. The Taliban said that 75% of schools are back in working condition as far as females are concerned. But without actual ability to verify this, it's difficult to be able to accept these terms right now. Many females are unable to return to work. There's a new UNDP report and indicates that Afghanistan is 166 out of 167 in the UN Gender Index, right at the bottom of the list. Having said that, they indicate also that Afghan economy will not recover without female participation. In the report, it indicates that contribution of educated women to the Afghan productivity is higher than that of men with the same level of education, maybe because they're able to take up the slack where the men cannot. Men become relaxed in their position of power and they don't work as hard, whilst females in Afghanistan especially have a need to fight and become more productive, and as a result produce more and be better for the economy. However, before the Taliban took over, there were 89 MPs out of the 352 MPs in the pre-Taliban government and 13 cabinet ministers. Right now, there are 0 cabinet ministers and there is no parliament. So there are no ministers or MPs at all, no representation at this moment in time. The situation of free media is very critical. The Taliban has limited expression, press expression under the threat of violence. In fact, many journalists have been beaten up under the threat of violence. They've stopped working or expressing themselves, and that violence could lead to death quite quickly or disappearances. And this has occurred. Whether they're accountable or not to the world, I think the world has basically forgotten about them over the past couple of months because COVID has taken over again over the winter. I think it's important that we keep an eye on this in the future. What are the Taliban's demands then? They want, as a government, they say that they have mutual needs. They want recognition. They want commitments from external parties, external governments, other countries around the world, international organizations such as the UN, IMF, the World Bank, for example. But they also want non-interference in the country. I think there's some veracity to the argument that interference has led to 40 years or 43 years of war. It was interference from external parties from the 1960s and 70s, from Pakistan, for example, or 1973, and the coup against Zahir Shah, who was a king, led a monarchy for around 250 years until he was overthrown in a bloodless coup by his cousin, which was instituted through influence from the Soviet Union. And then later the Saur Revolution, the communist coup in April the 25th of 1978, which led to a civil war and eventual Soviet intervention in Afghanistan on the 27th of December 1979. So we understand why the Taliban wants non-interference, because it wants to be able to foment itself and build its power structure. However, given that 43 and more, 50, 60, 70 years of interference from external parties, whether they're regional and super-regional, beyond the region, such as the larger powers, have led to 43 years of war and interference and millions of deaths. Literally millions of people have died and caused countless problems for the region. Then will this be possible at all? I mean, it's hard to believe that this can occur, given the grievances between regional countries such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and India and other countries who want to influence certain actions within Afghanistan for their own benefits, such as Russia against the United States. So we have to look at what the future goals are of Taliban. They want mutual respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, that's the same as any other country. Mutual non-aggression as any other country. Non-interference in each other's internal affairs. Mutual benefit via trade and peaceful coexistence. Now, this is what they want. And I think it's also a leverage that we can use. A lever that we can use for them to change the way they behave and what they're doing and their future plan for Afghanistan. I think it's important that they continue the liberalization of females, emancipation of females, and that they institute cooperation amongst countries, that they dilute the extremism to an extent, and that they are absolutely 100% against interference from non-state actors, especially violent non-state actors that might export their violence to regional and extra-regional countries. And one of the things that we can do is incentivize cooperation to get out female emancipation, to reduce the potential for extremist bases, targeting militancy within the Taliban as well as outside within the country, within Afghanistan, to help them to alleviate poverty as well. I think this is a mutual cooperation that we can utilize levers, because the Taliban wants certain things. So we can use incentives to get them to do things for the benefit of the future of the population in the country. And media freedom allows transparency to occur, and a transparency allows a certain degree of accountability. Although we're not looking at the same level of accountability and transparency as in leading Western nations. We're talking about one of the poorest nations that has just gotten onto the path again. But we do need to recognize that 43 years of war have occurred. In fact, more. By April, by the time they took over in August, the 15th, last year, it was 43 and a half years of war, constant conflict. Although there are sporadic attacks, it's not the same level as low intensity conflict even right now. I think there's got to be some appreciation that there is a potential for a future in Afghanistan. Yet we have to be very intelligent the way we utilize that. We need to get regional cooperation. Just recently, I was in Pakistan because I had some work to do over the Christmas period, and there was the OIC, the Islamic the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where the Islamic countries, around 55 countries plus, got together in Pakistan and shared an understanding of what they would like for the future of Afghanistan, primarily because predominantly, including Central Asian countries, the Islamic countries surround Afghanistan, and they would largely dictate what would happen in the future. And that includes Iran and Saudi Arabia, that there was an agreement that they would work together. But making statements in a conference where everybody's happy and having good tea and coffee and cookies and other good meals in a 5-star hotel is one thing. And translating that to ground realities, as I mentioned in many of the TV interviews I've given, it's okay to mention this thing, but everybody's going to say good things until it's translated into not just pledges, but actual money on the ground, changing dynamics, making and instituting leverage with the Taliban to change the way they think. Fundamentally, they're not going to change the way they think. We recognize that they have a particular philosophy, but they can liberalize to an extent and dilute that philosophy by relaxing it on the extreme fringes of it, to allow a certain degree of media freedom, to allow emancipation to occur, to allow education for all minorities and both genders and non-genders, and absolutely cooperate. In fact, the West can co-opt the Taliban, I feel, and I've suggested this many times, to some extent, whether it's overtly or covertly, to work together to reduce extremism in the country. But in doing so, they have to educate their own fighters as well, and they may require resources to do that. I think it's important that, as I mentioned, incentivization is the key to this. The key to making the Taliban get recognition. They want recognition in the world, but zero countries have recognized them because they're waiting to see what the Taliban does when they institute the regular government. This is right now only the interim government that they've made, and as a result, we have to wait to see what they do and the decisions that they make. And if they take a backward step, then I think the global community will become more hardened toward them. But I think also that if they liberalize to an extent and give a show of goodwill, and this goodwill could take many forms, that the West especially can show a small degree of goodwill as well. And it's a give and take, because 20 years of war is not a short period of time. The parties, the West has completely separated from Afghanistan, the Taliban, and vice versa. And it's going to take a long time for them to come onto the same platform to some extent. And when that occurs, and if there's some negotiation, I think we should push for that cooperation more than anything else, because if that doesn't happen, Taliban will become stricter and they will react, because they're quite reactionary at this moment in time. And if they become more reactionary, you're not going to see the freedom of females. You're not going to see education. In fact, you're going to see the reduction of education of females, reduction of emancipation, reduction of freedoms that they've got and general population. And I think this is the last thing that we want. I think what we want is Afghanistan to become part of the global community. And at least if it's not the full extent of the progress that's been made at this point in time, that they try to take back some of the progress that's been made over the last couple of decades, especially. And that it's not a lost cause altogether, because that could result in further conflict and bloodshed, which is going to be absolutely detrimental to the people of Afghanistan, more importantly. Because I think resolving differences in the future, that we want extra regional security and stability, especially, I think people are eyeing up Central Asian energy corridors, Pakistan, Iran, and Saudis, and India even, looking, because Afghanistan would be a perfect corridor for oil and gas, especially gas from Turkmenistan, coming through, which allow it to have a certain degree of independence in energy terms, which will allow it to build itself again. Extra-regional integration would be needed. And this conference that occurred just a couple of weeks ago would be maybe the first stage of that. But that needs to be made more concrete again. Enhanced trade. I think once you see these benefits coming into effect, what you will also see is that there'll be more discussion on BRI, where Afghanistan could be benefiting from infrastructure development the way that it hasn't before. Then again, there'll be opposition to that from the West, primarily because they'll feel that the Taliban have fallen completely into the hands of the Chinese. So I think it's a slow step into the future. And as I believe that the future is economic density, that all countries define themselves, build themselves, the density of economic progress within the country requires infrastructure building, the correct transparency and accountability mechanisms to be put in place in all aspects of society, economically, commercially, politically, socially, and culturally also, where freedoms are provided and instituted and protected. I believe that's the future of Afghanistan. However, it is just a beginning and the future is still unknown. But the potential of it is there, and it's in the hands of the real economic powers in the region and beyond. And it's just a matter of certain degree of cooperation to allow that to occur. Whether that will happen or not, given the current environment, geopolitical environment, is anybody's guess, though. And unfortunately, humans tend to have a tendency to always repeat the mistakes they've made in the past. And so we've got to be very careful on what we do in the future. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome.
You may talk. So I'm going to go off the full screen
Yep, that's
to
great.
take questions if you have any.
Yes,
And
there'll be
we'll
I'm
go
sure there's lots of questions. Just we're not using the chat or QA session, so if anyone, please, in fact,
You'll have to speak up a little bit because
yep,
my
okay, I will
my
do.
speech
Yes,
aren't the best from
I'm
the
sure
computer
there'll
laptop.
be a lot of questions for you. Please feel free to ask Aqab put a question to him.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
I think Jen is the one who's in charge of the chair.
Yeah,
So
yes, but no,
Okay.
they can go
ask
ahead.
questions or not, and I'll just answer.
Yep, please do.
Thank you. And thank you very much. That was really, really interesting and worrying. I wanted to ask you, Gordon Brown wrote an article in The Guardian today saying that the desperate poverty in Afghanistan, since Western money has disappeared, that needs address, regardless of alliances or working things out with the Taliban, that needs addressing immediately, that thousands and thousands of people are just going to die of starvation very, very soon. What's your view about that?
I agree to some extent. I think it's not about putting new money in. Large billions of dollars of assets have been frozen by the United States. And as a result, that is Afghan money. But there's a fear that the Taliban would use it for other means. You've got to appreciate that the United States has been fighting the Taliban for the last 20 years. So they still see each other as enemies. And the Taliban wants its money back, but the fact of the matter is it's in the hand of the enemies. And the Americans have left in defeat, in essence, because they did not fulfill their objectives. And that's what defeat means. I mean, some people, I hear on many forums, the Americans say that we can bomb the hell out of Afghanistan, we can destroy them, just throw a few nuclear weapons. But that doesn't mean you've actually won a war. You've just killed the whole country and killed millions of people. That's not winning a war. Winning a war means that you fulfill your objectives and policy objectives, which were quite ad hoc, and they kept on changing. So there was never going to be a win because the Taliban saw the longer picture. Having said that, this is in the hands of the United States and the larger Western powers, whether they want to do that. And again, as I've said, we need to incentivize change. I might sound very harsh in this. The fact of the matter is, if the Taliban want something, they have to give something to get something. And that's how you play politics. That's how the real world works. The fact of the matter is, the United States has said, well, you fought for 20 years, and now you have it. Now deal with it. The fact of the matter is, the Taliban were completely unprepared for this. And they don't have the professionalism to run a government. And so they're finding it very difficult. And they didn't really appreciate that it would take so much money. I don't think they really were cognizant of the fact that they would be running government so quickly. They thought that they would be preparing for it because once the Americans left, that they would be fighting the existing government, which would still have money coming in, such as in the 1990s when the communist PDPA were still in power for 3 years, whilst Soviet Union funded them. Eventually, when the funds dried out, they collapsed. What happened is that this didn't happen this time. I think people predicted that the Afghan army, the idea was the Afghan army was going to be very strong and they'll maintain resistance, but it didn't happen. And so everybody was taken by surprise. So the Taliban never really built up this idea that they would be able to maintain a government. And they didn't realize in real terms what would happen because they've not been in the government. They don't know what money needs to go where and what is needed by the government because they didn't have access to the accounts or the treasury, for example, in real terms. So there has to be some degree of negotiation within Afghanistan for those people who are working, the technocrats, the diplomats, and the professionals who are working in the country to come back rather than depart from the country because they're the ones who are going to be the future of the country. But they're not going to come back if they feel the Taliban are going to victimize them. So there has to be some form of compromise on all sides. And I think the West is waiting for the Taliban to show that they're going to change and that they say that they've changed, but they need to show that they've changed. And so far, nothing has really been done, especially in the all-male government. This was a promise that the Taliban made, and they're not done it. So it's unfortunate. And yes, people will die. But it was the Taliban that wanted the government. And I know it sounds very harsh for me to say this, but the Taliban wanted the government. Now they have to learn to deal with it. This is why the Organization of Islamic Cooperation occurred, the conference in Islamabad just a couple of weeks ago, to talk about how the Muslim nations would help. And I've heard lots of pledges to, the fact of the matter is, the Saudis can easily put billions of dollars into it if they wanted to. But they're not going to put money into an empty pit. They're going to want something back. And that's what that's going to create problems with Iran. Yeah. And the Indians may, but that's going to create problems with Pakistan. So then you're going to have bitterness and then shoring up of different parties again. And that could lead to another civil war. So we have to be very careful in this to understand how it works. And yes, Afghanistan does say that their assets are frozen, but these were the assets of former government. And the new government has no assets. So how are they going to deal with it? You see, it's a catch-22. And maybe thousands of people will die because of starvation. I think the Americans need to look at the humanitarian aspects. And if they can coordinate money coming into Afghanistan without it going through the government, going directly through the NGOs who will be providing sustenance and food to the right population centers where they matter on a list of priorities, that could work if the Taliban allows this. But then the Taliban is insecure as well because it's just set up a government. It doesn't want interference. It feels that maybe foreign agents will come in and start interfering again. So there's that kind of balance of power issue between them. There's a competitive edge there as well. And I think there's got to be a give for both sides to show goodwill for the benefit of the people, because I don't think the Taliban are going to suffer. It is the people that are going to suffer. And then I think both parties will be to blame in that respect, because they weren't able to come to some form of negotiation for the benefit of the population, which is fundamentally the most important aspect, really. And the human rights aspect of that is the number one feature that we need to look at.
Any more?
Thank you.
I've got,
Yeah, thank you, Aqab. Any further, anyone else?
I've got a question.
Yeah, okay, Chris.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the Belt Initiative. Looking at the Chinese model in Africa, they've invested a lot of money in infrastructure in African countries and got their foothold in with indebtedness. I'm interested in this conflict of philosophies because the Chinese leadership have made it very clear that Marxist Leninism is to be spread throughout the world, and their model of politics and way occurring and the way they deal with Uyghur Muslims. Do you think the Chinese are going to make any headway in Afghanistan with those conflicts? Because obviously it's a very good pathway for them and a very valuable way through into other areas. I'm interested to see how the Chinese are going to get on, or are they're obviously want to influence this one-upmanship on the Americans. I wonder what you thought about that.
I've been to China many times with delegations, official delegations. I've also been teaching in China, teaching international relations, even terrorism studies and geopolitics. And the truth of the matter is China is no longer a communist country. Its economic system is state capitalism. It's state control, but it's capitalism in its fullest extent. It would never have made the progress it's made without having gone down the capitalist route. The fact of the matter is free market economics to an extent is largely what happens in China right now. Control to some extent, but the larger companies really don't have that much control. In fact, that was one of the things that was pointed out to Xi Jinping, the leader of the Communist Party, the premier or the president, they can call him now, of China. When the Belt and Road Initiative was announced and there was a policy of go out. So companies were encouraged to go out and invest in different countries. And largely it wasn't 100% organized by the government. Agreements between companies in different countries, and those countries were made independently of the government. But what was happening initially was that they were taking advantage of local environment, and that started leading to a very negative backlash towards China around the world. So I think they've reconfigured things and shored that control up of their own companies, which are very large multinationals now. The thing of the matter is that Afghanistan is just one country where there's large deposits of minerals, which are going to no doubt be of benefit, and they're being eyed up by Chinese. They put $8 billion into the Ainak copper mine north of Kabul. But nothing's been done so far. It's basically at a standstill because of the instability. So they stopped spending any more money because they found that it was going to be a mistake to put more money into Afghanistan until there's some semblance of peace. So as I mentioned in the talk, the Chinese are avidly watching, actively watching Afghanistan to see where it develops, to see what it can do. You mentioned Marxist-Leninism. That's going to have zero effect on Afghanistan now. They went through the period of communism, and you know what that led to. It's 43 years of war, and this is the culmination of it. So that's not going to happen. I mean, you could read that in the books, but practical realities are something else altogether. The fact of the matter is, maybe people have sympathies towards communism, but the fact of the matter is, it's dead and gone in Afghanistan. It's not going to happen. I think the Taliban are more capitalist than anything else. They're into free trade. As an ethnic group, Taliban represent 90-something%, represented by the Pashtun. Fundamentally capitalist, wherever you go. I'm a Pashtun, and I'm a landlord as well. So I don't believe in the state taking control of my land. That's my freehold land, and I've got large tracts of land and properties. As a result, I'd like to keep control of that, and we're very, very much independent in that respect. I think if the Taliban treads, that's one of the foremost reasons as to why there was a counter-revolution to the communist revolution, because the control of land, the landlords didn't want that. They utilize religion to foment opposition against the communist control and the Soviet Union, but essentially it was the control of land and the reformation of land borders, for example, and these were the issues that fomented the war. I think the Taliban are completely opposed to this. In fact, in the Islamic system that they have, capitalism, free market economics is very much welcome. So that's not going to happen. You don't need to fear that. What is going to happen is the leverage that the Chinese may gain. But I think fundamentally, the Taliban are against the idea of usury, the use of high interest rates. Fundamentally, philosophically, they're against that. That's fundamental to their philosophy. So they're going to be negotiating very carefully. Unlike Pakistan, Pakistan, for example, is controlled by many power centers, and there was a lot of corruption in that country during the Nawaz Sharif government, which gave way to deals through corrupt methods and bribing officials to get deals by the Chinese. They bribed wholeheartedly, and I've seen this happen. So they may do to some extent with the Afghans, but I don't think we can really dictate what will happen. We can really foresee or speculate the Chinese will get to any good or not. But they're carefully watching the situation right now. Afghanistan does need infrastructure, but if it goes into debt, I think the Taliban are astute enough to know what the value of their own economy is if it comes alive. But we want that. So I think free market economics, I think they recognize that they would want participation by many states, not just one state. And this is where we would like. But the fact of the matter is, nobody really knows what's going to happen as far as China is
I
concerned.
think time's moving on. I think I'll probably allow just a couple more questions. If they don't,
I have a question, Mr.
okay, all right, Said.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Jayan. I'm from Professor Malik's conversation that there was a failing of Afghan government in corruption in army, that they could not trace out the corruption in army, like in salary or other hierarchy process. So why the USA-backed Afghan government, or like Mr. Karzai's government or Mr. Ghani's government, could fail to trace the original reasons of the corruption there? Second question is about the process of recovery, war or sanction or other economic issues. Are the from international community is the solution process, or negotiation or diplomacy is the process? What is the view from Mr. Malik? Thank you.
Right, thank you. I'll answer the first one, not ask the question. I'll answer the first question. Corruption, yes. You've got to appreciate that when the United States came into Afghanistan, the Taliban represented the Pashtun community predominantly. And in essence, even though they control most of the country, that the opposition was a group, the Northern Alliance, which was composed of the Uzbeks, Hazaras, and the Tajiks, who are the minority groups. So what happened in 1992, for example, just to give you a comparison, was that Najibullah, who was a president at the time and the communist president in 1992, from 1999 to 92, and before that, he gave power directly to Abdul Rashid Dostum. In fact, when they collapsed, the communists collapsed, Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was part of the communist militia, sided with Ahmad Shah Massoud, another minority, the Tajik minority. He is an Uzbek, sided with that, and that fomented the civil war because they took control of Kabul against the agreement that was made with Gulbuddin Ahmadiyya in 1992, the Pashtun majority leader, the largest Pashtun Mujahideen group. And that led to the civil war, for 2 years and more, in fact. What happened now is that in 2001, when the Americans came, they saw a beachhead in the northern Afghanistan, in Badakhshan province, about 5% of the country, and that was held by the Northern Alliance, specifically the Tajiks, and Ahmad Shah Massoud, who just died a couple of days before 9/11. But they were still held by the Tajiks. And in doing so, the Tajiks took general power, like they did in 1992, against the idea of all equality. They took power when they could. And it's happened before in history where minorities try to take power as much as they can to foment power, and then the opposition comes again to retake it back. But what happened with the Americans supported that. And Fahim, and General Fahim, he called himself Field Marshal. He became charge of the as Ministry of Defense. And he requisitioned most resources towards certain sections of the minorities, but not the majority. And as a result, the National Afghan Army was commanded by minorities, but not the majority. Now, that enabled the Taliban to have more of a rationale and motivation to fight against the minority. It was an ethnic. I mean, the ethnicity and the difference in the fishes never changed. It didn't end. It was always there. So they instituted Karzai as a president, who was, by the way, a UNICAL executive, worked with Bush well before the 9/11 attacks. So they were all friends and buddies. So they put them in. Not that he was capable of actually running the country, but what happens in politics is that everybody becomes paranoid about things, and he became especially paranoid about what was going on. The corruption set in primarily because they empowered the existing warlords, the people who had massacred and killed thousands of people, and the Americans empowered the wrong people because they were the existing people in charge.
Yes,
So
yes.
either it was the warlords or in opposition to the Taliban, or it was the Taliban you're going to empower. Well, you're against the Taliban, so you don't have any of the parties. You empower the warlords like Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was a vicious, it still is a vicious warlord, and other people like him, and Fahim, who took the ministries. They took the relative ministries as deputy presidents and this and the other. So no doubt, they're not going to change their spots, are they? They're not going to change their character. They were corrupt throughout. They willingly killed and massacred people en masse. And the Taliban remember that. So, you know, the fact of the matter is that that's not going to change the governance structure and how it's worked. When you have the wrong people beginning a government, what's going to happen for the rest of the 20 years? They're going to institute their power centers, build them up, and maintain that power structure. And you call it democracy. That's not democracy. Democracy is just a vote. People don't even understand what democracy is in Afghanistan. All they knew at the end of it was that there was massive corruption. $2.26 trillion, according to Brown University, went into Afghanistan. And a lot of it filtered out into the pockets of the leaders. Millions and millions of each leader. And they're not going to benefit the country. I mean, a lot of it obviously went into the country, but that's where the corruption took part. And the culture of corruption set in over the last 2 decades. A massive bad culture of corruption. And that's something that the Taliban have to contend with. They may be very strict in this, and everybody's going to argue. The extreme liberals, I call them extreme liberals because they have no sense of reality, on the ground reality, is that the Taliban will be quite harsh with a lot of the people to stem corruption to some extent. Obviously, there is corruption within the Taliban as well. It's become culturally inset, intertwined within the fabric of society, unfortunately. And that's going to be hard to get out. And that's where a lot of the money went. And the power brokers were there in power. Now, that structure's changed. But whether they will continue that or not, but they're going to face power centers as they arise when they start compromising. People will, this is how power works. Where somebody builds their power center up in certain areas, you've got to negotiate with them. The reason Taliban got into Afghanistan, Kabul, and took government was because it compromised and negotiated its way into Afghanistan, into governance again. That's what it did. There was no doubt there was a mass degree of corruption involved there. There's debts paid off and money paid off to certain power centers and power brokers and warlords who took sides with the Taliban instead of the government. So this is become the culture. It wasn't like this before, but it has become this because the Americans see it as a cash cow. There was lots of money coming in. So that everybody wanted to grab it whilst it was there. And everybody knew it was going to end eventually. It was going to end eventually. And now that's the problem now. And the Americans very much aware of that they just kept on throwing money into a black hole. And it's back to where it was. And now release of that money that you indicated earlier is going to be difficult unless it goes into the right hands and the right trusted bodies and NGOs, for example, that are allowed in to do the work. No doubt there are going to be people in charge of the power, certain avenues of this are going to try to stifle some of that money and steal it. And this is unfortunate. And the second question, I can't remember what that was. So I didn't hear it properly, in fact.
Well, I
Well,
think,
my second question was.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit conscious of the time. I just want to end because it's already nearly
Gone
quarter
too far
to
on.
9. And I just want to have the prerogative of the final question is what can the UN and its agencies, will they have any influence now in Afghanistan? Will the UN agencies, I know at the moment the World Food Programme are providing all the food and everything. Will the Taliban, will the UN agency be able to work with freedom or not?
We can look at what happened in the 1990s. When I was there doing my research, I went into Afghanistan on a number of occasions for prolonged periods to understand what was going on in the ground. And I was a guest of the United Nations, different agencies, many times. They were working on the ground because the Afghan Taliban recognized that they couldn't do everything alone. They couldn't do the reconstruction alone. They needed the UN, the help of the UN. But the UN also needed to recognize them as well. They need to recognize their status. Now, it's a legal issue. What is a UN body as far as the Taliban is concerned? And what is the Taliban as far as the UN is concerned? Is it a illegal government, or is it the actual legal government of the country? So the negotiations as far as that concerned, because once the UN recognizes what the Taliban is, then they can learn to negotiate with that particular party. It's a legal issue within the UN. I think that's under debate. I think what also matters is that the UN will require a certain degree of freedom and protection, by the way, because there are still parties who are opposed to the Taliban, such as the Islamic State Khorasan, who will undoubtedly attack the UN if the UN made any attempt at distributing food through the World Food Programme. And the health issues are taken care of by who? The World Health Organization. So these agencies need to have a certain degree of protection by the Taliban, but it also needs to have that legal wrangling to be completed as well. And that's unfortunate because people are going to suffer and die because of the famine that's going to occur. I think it's important to make haste in this, but the international powers are the ones who are the brokers of the United Nations. Who is the largest body and funder of the United Nations? The United States. So they generally do dictate where the money goes and how much goes where. And that was an enemy of the Taliban. So there's got to be some degree of flexibility, I think, with the UN. But we've got to remember that the UN is just an international organization, and it doesn't have teeth without sanctions being imposed through the Security Council and the General Assembly. So nothing like that's happened so far. Or there's not been an extensive debate about this yet. Until that occurs, the UN doesn't really have any teeth to go about doing anything, really. Say, for example, the protection of its workers. Now, it can, on a low level, can work, but at a substantial level, it's going to be very difficult. The UN is composed of other nations, and they could have issues, and they could veto anything in the Security Council, and that would cause problems. So I think the international powers are going to be the ones that dictate what happens. The UN is just a body, a tool, or a vessel through which they dictate terms to the Taliban. And that's going to happen for the foreseeable future until the Taliban actually do give way to some extent about what they do and what they want. It's a compromise on both sides. But there's intransigence on both sides right now. It's going to take some time to melt and fizzle out and relax. So unfortunately, the people will suffer.
Right. So on that note, well, thank you very much indeed, Aqab, for coming and speaking to us, giving us a lot of food for thought. And yes, we got better understanding, background to the Afghan situation. Thank you very much indeed for giving up your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we'd like to show our appreciation. Thank you.
Mute.
Who knows? Soon I'll be working
Thank
for the
you.
UN. I've applied for many jobs in the UN. Maybe I can do something in this.
Sorry?
I'll be applying. I've been applying for quite a few positions in the UN, and hopefully somebody will say, "Hey, he knows something."
Oh, that's great.
Because I've so far I've only met people who are quite young in the 30s dictating terms right now, so it's very difficult. You need to talk to the right people.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll publish
Thank
this
you
as
very
well.
much. We just want to say
Thank you.
thank you to everyone and
you.
being with us.
Thank you, Guillaume.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Guillaume.
much.
Thank you very much, all of you, for
you.
being present.
Thank
and,
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Aqab, you'll be hearing
Thank
from
you.
me
Good
soon.
night.
Thank you. Thank you all.
live long and prosper.
And you. Yep. Thank you.
Live long.
Bye-bye, Saeed.
Bye-bye. Everybody's leaving.
Bye. Bye, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, hello, Margaret. Bye-bye.
Oh, hello, Gian. Hello.
Is
We'll
Andrew?
catch up soon.
Yep. Andrew well?
Yes, thank you.
That's
Yes,
great.
yeah, thank you.
Okay.